It's great to be back at Duke, and welcome, Diane.
Thank you, Elaine.
So for those of you who don't know Diane is the Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer at Kellogg Company. You represent one of the world's biggest food companies, and we just talked a lot about risks and opportunities and climate change. How does Kellogg Company factor climate change into your organization and your business strategy?
I was really glad to hear Elizabeth and then Kate. And Catherine also speaking about the importance of our food systems in this climate discussion, because appropriately so, we talk a lot about energy, we talk a lot about infrastructure in the climate debate, but food systems fail faster. And this is a core issue of business continuity for us as the Kellogg Company. We're a global food company. We source ingredients around the world. And for us to have continued access to ingredients, we have to have sufficient water, healthy soils, and resilient farming communities, which are often on the edge of these climate resilience risks. But it's not just us as the Kellogg Company who have to rely on this. Anybody in the room here depend on food? Right? This is really a core issue for all of us, and it's one that's at the forefront of our thinking.
So, I mean, clearly it's a very unpredictable time. I mean, you've got devastating hurricanes in Puerto Rico, Texas, Florida. You have Cape Town about to run out of water, fresh water. You've got the Arctic this winter being warmer than parts of Europe. How do you plan for a future that does not yet exist?
Yeah, we like to recognize that it's both volatile and uncertain.
Right.
There are climate and environmental issues that we have to grapple with. I'll give you a quick example there, and then we'll shift to a quick policy example.
Sure.
As I shared that we depend on agriculture ingredients, primarily grains. Rice Krispies are puffed grains of rice. About 10 years ago in Australia, when they faced their first round of truly devastating droughts, our ability to source rice in Australia for our operations there completely evaporated. That took us several years to create a whole new supply chain for that rice, actually out of Vietnam and Thailand, where we're working with smallholder farmers, primarily in Thailand. But it's not only there. In Europe, we were sourcing rice out of Egypt. And as we saw the Arab Spring starting to rise, really coming out of increasing food prices from volatile fires in Russia, big climate connections there. The models hopefully could have predicted some of that then. We weren't able to source rice for our European operations out of Egypt. Now, for us as a global company, that means money. We've got to go out and find another source. But for those farming communities who can no longer grow enough rice, sell enough rice, depend on that income for their families and their livelihoods, that's devastating. So we've got to be thinking at multiple layers on how we get after these issues. But if I switch it into policy, the recent bans that China took saying, we're not going to keep importing all of your recycled materials any longer. Wow, has that had a huge shift on impact for pricing the recycling economy. And we've seen policy shifts and customer shifts moving extremely quickly, not here in the US, primarily in Europe and in other markets, to address packaging and plastic packaging in particular. So these kinds of things can move far faster than sometimes we realize or plan for.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously Kellogg Company being a multinational company, you're thinking about global trade, global policies. We were talking about carbon pricing, obviously, as part of that.
Absolutely.
And I think it's interesting because, talking about how now policy in China no longer taking recyclables from outside is really creating a forcing function for potential innovation, right? Where
Correct.
you have these things called the circular economy models and things like that, where you're reinventing the way that you potentially don't waste anymore, right? So what's the kind of innovation that Kellogg Company is kind of taking on in terms of this climate change opportunity?
Absolutely. Let me take a moment. I'll use that to talk about structure very quickly.
Sure.
When I first joined the Kellogg Company 10 years ago, we lived within our global supply chain operations. Very appropriate, because that's where we execute all of our work from a procurement standpoint, from a manufacturing standpoint. Coming into Paris and the Paris agreements, when we announced our scope 1, 2, and 3 science-based targets out to 2050 in support of the governments that were making those commitments, we actually shifted it into corporate affairs because this aspect of partnership was so incredibly critical. But where I'm actually spending most of my time these days is with our innovation, brand, and customer teams. Cool. And specifically to this issue, because as we think about how do we design food, how do we design packaging that is resilient, that's exciting, and then taking in the consumer dynamic, all of us, everybody, you know, I don't know how many of you look on your labels and think about where your products come from, much less where your food comes from. Food's intensely personal. And so we find that, and it's intensely creative too. So people really want to make smart decisions about what food they're choosing for themselves and their families. And that aspect of innovation, with of course circular economy behind it, for food that's easy, for packaging it's hard, starts to really come together.
So I mean, that kind of ties into the fact that climate change is not only affected by policy and communities and technology and all these other factors, but also at the heart of the food, energy, water nexus,
Absolutely.
which Kellogg Company certainly lives in. So I guess the question I have is, I mean, you guys have a lot of initiatives, you know, one on 100% renewables pursuits, one on food waste, water innovation, et cetera. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you're working with different stakeholders, both externally and internally, to tackle some of your initiatives?
Yeah, this is a space that no one entity, no one company can really have a meaningful impact alone. So stakeholder partnership is critical. And when you think about core skill sets, especially for everybody in the room here today, that ability to engage with internal and particularly external partners to drive against a common objective when everybody has a slightly different agenda there is a really critical and core skill set. So be thinking about that piece. But we work with governments, we work with peer companies, we work with, you know, General Mills is a great example. Fierce competitors at the shelf, but boy, do we share the same pre-competitive risks. So for us to be able to address soil health and sourcing of needs here in the US, critically important. But we work with a lot of activists as well. We've got a lot of NGO friends who their agenda, they can leverage our global brand for their agenda and drive change. I'd say the only time our CEO was ever asked a environmental sustainability social question in our quarterly analysts call was on palm oil and deforestation and human rights. And it's one of our smallest ingredients, but it's one of our biggest risk areas. So this aspect of how things come and circle around and who you have to work with to help to really get after these very hairy, wicked problems becomes a core skill set.
That's interesting. I want to talk about the functions within your internal structure as well. You're talking a little bit about how, you know, you've shifted from global supply chains to more of the corporate affairs to branding and innovation. How do you integrate all of this across the company internally?
So we have a very small, what I would call a sustainability function team, and that's very much by design because we've chosen to really embed what this work means into how the business is executed. So we have engineering teams who have shared accountabilities on our energy and water strategies. Same within our operations. We've got procurement category leaders whose part of their accountabilities is responsibly sourcing those ingredients and materials for the business. So there's a lot of support and enablement. But even within our innovation teams, there's folks who have this as part of how they do their work. And I think that that's really critically important to be thinking around how you build stakeholder engagement internally around a common business goal. As a company, we've got a business strategy. Everybody's got one. Ours has a top line that really focuses on what you would expect a company like Kellogg to focus on. How are we going to win in the occasion? What's our strategy for channels and getting to market and go to shelf? What are the, you know, there's the 4 business sort of category pieces. Right underneath that are what we call the heart and soul strategy pieces. What's the enabling mechanisms that allow us to really win with that work? Nurturing the planet, feeding people in need, addressing nutrition and founders' values are all there as part of that. So it's how we really embed into the full commercial strategy what this work enables for the company.
How do you keep them accountable? Is that just the guiding, you know, principles for us to operate, or are you embedding that into their metrics? Is there potential internal carbon? What are you guys thinking about?
We do. We report quarterly. Okay. Well, we report monthly through our entire global supply chain on how our operations are doing on their monthly goals that lead all the way out to 2020 and beyond. They have annual targets with the work that they're doing. We have quarterly reporting, and then twice a year we report to our board. And of course we have all of our external reporting as well, and we've really changed the way we're doing that. We've been working very closely with SASB, for example, and have really just increased our amount of reporting directly in the 10K, so it's not just in corporate responsibility. But coming back internally, those metrics and those deliveries are all the way up to our CEO and are part of bonus structures.
Cool.
So it's thinking through how we drive this holistically.
So we're going to take some questions from the audience to start lining up. If you can, we at least a couple questions. And so while that happens, hopefully there are some questions. Nobody's walking up here. Well, we've got a room full of global MBA students here, obviously. What advice can you offer them as they embark on a career that's not necessarily going to be in sustainability?
I would hope that all of you, when you're in your roles, wherever you choose to go, think about systemically what are the risks and opportunities that sustainability and climate change pose for you as your organization. I've talked already within Kellogg, there's accountabilities and expectations within procurement and sourcing, within global operations, within innovation, within sales and marketing. All of these pieces with our policy teams, these all have to work together to really drive growth in a way that gets consumers excited about why they love the Kellogg Company and the foods they pick for their families. Those touch on almost any area that many of you are probably looking to go into. So taking that systemic approach, thinking creatively and continuously being curious around what's new and how it drives innovation and impact are what I would encourage you to really bring to any role that you choose to go into as your next steps.
Great. Question?
Hey, so I'm Jeff Luke. I'm an MBA at UNC and an MEM at Duke's Nicholas School. And I know there's an interesting article recently about the inflationary pressures in the food industry, particularly that Kellogg and General Mills are facing right now with rising input costs.
Yep.
I'm interested from your perspective, how much of that is inflationary pressure versus maybe climate related or kind of pressures driven by things going on in ag?
So commodity pricing is a big deal for companies like us and others who rely on those crops and ingredients. They tend to fluctuate annually or even more crop by crop season. We look at that both on how do we hedge for that now and what do we need to be looking towards for where do we need to be growing our crops, where is there water scarcity risk, where is there water benefit, how are we looking at working with our farmers around the world on soil quality so that we can have that improved continuity of supply. The more we engage through our supply base back to the farm, even though we're paying those market prices, we actually have better quality, better quantity coming into our business, and we have pricing enablement that we can do along those lines that are wins at the farm level all the way through to Kellogg. So of course we have to engage and understand where that pricing and hedging will impact our financials, but we've put work into place with around the world actually at the farm level to try to mitigate some of that risk to our business. And we don't own farms, by the way. So all of that has to be done in partnership with our suppliers and with other types of entities that bring value then to that farm equation.
So we know that food trends can determine what is placed in the grocery stores. And I'm thinking specifically about the trend of almond milk coming in and also now the keto diets or high fat and high protein and low carbs. And are you guys trying to impact the trends that people are looking into in order to make them more sustainable?
It's a great question. There's a big answer in all of that. I'll do a little plug for the session this afternoon on food and ag. The case study there is going to be how do you take the type of work that the Kellogg Company is doing and bring it to life to excite consumers in the food space and what they want to buy. So bringing that kind of marketing and branding mechanism to that case study piece for exactly that reason. But in answer to your question, yes. So a simple example is how do we design for cereals, which are less than half of our business today, to taste really good in almond milk and not just in skim or preferably full fat if you're like me. But But we're also looking at what are the implications for plant protein versus animal protein. How do we drive that plant protein benefit that a lot of our foods can and increasingly include, because that has a real social and environmental benefit for both human health and planetary health. And we're actually working in a consortium with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the EAT Foundation called FRESH that is really working fork or spoon backwards around how do we engage consumers in decision making that creates both human health and planetary health benefits. And what does that then look like backwards?
And that actually ties into the other pre-competitive collaborative that you have around food loss and waste.
Absolutely, with Champions 12.3.
Yeah, there's just a ton of food being wasted as well as not being consumed, obviously.
Yes.
And the use by, sell by dates, like
yes.
really streamlining that, I think that's really fascinating. What is the group called?
So there's a group called Champions 12.3. The
right.
Sustainable Development Goals are something that we haven't actually talked about here very much, but something that our work really does ladder all up to. Kellogg, our work is really primarily within Sustainable Development Goal 2, which is around eliminating hunger
right. through
sustainable food systems. But Sustainable Development Goal 12 is around sustainable consumption and products, and 12.3 is around halving food loss and waste. Right. If we can halve food loss, we'll increase the food availability by over 30% globally. That has tremendous benefit when you think about land use pressures, natural resource pressures, and human health advantages. Right. So working together in collaborations like Champions 12.3 allow us to be advocates for what does it mean to change date labeling here in the US so that everybody has best by on their label, so that when we pick it up and look at it, it's not sell by or
use by.
Yeah, expires on, or whatever the case is. And we've already transitioned 50% of our labels here in the US to that consistent best by date. We found that even within our own operations, we had inconsistency because here in the US we don't have regulation for it. So right. trying to make those changes can make a big difference.
So just to connect the dots on that, obviously the food loss and waste is a humongous issue in terms of tying you into to Catherine's talk on methane emissions, as well as a number of other resource issues in terms of the production of this wasted food. So it's kind of full circle here in terms of that kind of systemic impact and how you guys are trying to do it from this direction, whereas others are doing it from the other. Another question.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a dual degree student here at Duke, and you have your own supply chain, but you're also part of other companies' supply chains, so like companies like Walmart. And so, yes. How do things like Project Gigaton filter down to you guys? And does it make you want to exceed your goals in order to get more shelf space, or how does that work? And is it a competitive advantage for you?
I love that question. So is anybody familiar with, so Walmart has a goal called Project Gigaton, where they plan to reduce a gigaton worth of greenhouse gas emissions through their supply chain, of which we are, of course, a part. And we worked very closely. In fact, we were part of the CEO team that helped to launch that 2 years ago, or last year, it's a bit of a blur, when that actually came out. And that's a really critical part of how we need to quantify what our contribution is, not just in our own value chain, but actually, as you pointed out, how we then benefit our customers as well. And when we can partner with them on things like the Midwest Row Crop Collaborative, which is another great cooperative where we're audaciously trying to address the hypoxia zone reduction in the Gulf of Mexico, small issues. We're actually also getting after reducing greenhouse gases at farm level and how that then goes into the food that we sell in Walmarts. And we're actually going to be testing that in stores in the Midwest here this summer in Walmart stores and see if consumers really resonate to that food, farm, climate issue. So I'll be curious to see. But it's really, really important that we connect our work with our customers' objectives as well as through our brands to try to engage people with us on this journey.
So the plug is that if you want to learn more from Diane, she's going to be at a lunch table as well as being part of a food and ag industry session where you can dive a little deeper into what she just talked about. But last question, in closing, what are you optimistic about?
Oh my gosh, so much. The fact that you all are here, I'm incredibly optimistic about that. I really do feel that we are at an incredible tipping point. the horror is there, but the opportunity and the motivation to do so is really clear. And when we're starting to see companies like all of those who are here with the leadership position and the supply chain and consumer engagement, and then our future leaders who are sitting here in the room wanting to be able to figure out how they apply this into the work that you will do every day, that gives me huge reason for optimism. So being here with you all is a great source for that.
Well, thanks for joining us.